The greatest general Islam ever produced started as Islam's deadliest enemy. This is not a contradiction. This is history. In the spring of 625, on a hillside called Uhud just outside Medina, an Islamic army faced annihilation. The Muslims had been winning. The battle was turning in their favor. They were close to breaking Quraysh, the pagan Arab confederation that ruled Mecca. And then, one cavalry commander changed everything. His name was Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was 25 years old. He had never lost a battle. He would never lose one. But on that day at Uhud, he was fighting against Islam itself. The Muslims didn't know who he was yet. They would learn. Oh, they would learn. Khalid ibn al-Walid would become the name that made them afraid. The Muslim commanders would eventually call him the Sword of Allah, Saif Allah. But first, they had to survive what he was about to do. According to the 9th century Islamic historian al-Tabari, writing from detailed accounts preserved among the earliest Muslim communities, the Muslim forces at Uhud had pushed back the Quraysh cavalry. The pagans were retreating. Victory seemed certain. But the Muslim archers, stationed on a hill to protect the right flank, broke formation to pursue the fleeing enemy and collect spoils. This was the moment. This was the gap. Khalid ibn al-Walid saw it. Riding with about 300 cavalry, elite Meccan horsemen, trained since childhood to move as a single organism across the desert, Khalid wheeled his mounted archers around. He struck the exposed Muslim flank like a sickle. The Islamic army, vulnerable and scattered, began to collapse. The historian al-Baladuri, writing in the 9th century, records that in the chaos and cavalry charge that followed, 70 Muslims were killed in minutes. The Quraysh, who moments before had been defeated, suddenly found themselves victorious. The Battle of Uhud turned. The Muslims broke and fled toward Medina. The Prophet Muhammad himself was wounded in the fighting. His front teeth were broken. Blood ran down his face. He escaped with a small group of followers, rallying them to a nearby hill, while Khalid and the Quraysh cavalry pursued. But pursuit turned to caution. The Muslims had regrouped. The route stopped. And Khalid, recognizing the danger of a counterattack against his cavalry, made the tactical decision to hold position rather than pursue further. The battle ended. Quraysh claimed victory, not a complete victory, but a reversal, an Islamic defeat, and everyone who witnessed it on both sides understood who had done this. Khalid ibn al-Walid had stopped Islam's momentum. He had saved Mecca's way of life. He had proven himself the finest military mind the Arabs had yet produced. The question everyone began asking was this: who was he? Where did this man come from? What made him different? Khalid was born around 585 CE into the Makhzum tribe, one of the 10 most powerful families in Mecca. This was aristocracy in its absolute form. The Makhzum were merchants, warriors, landowners. They controlled trade routes that ran north to Syria and south to Yemen. They sat in the councils of Quraysh. Khalid's father, al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, was one of the most respected elders in Mecca. His uncle, a man named al-Abbas, would later convert to Islam and become the Prophet's trusted companion. But young Khalid took a different path. He was a soldier from the beginning, not a scholar, not a poet, not a businessman, a soldier. His tribe's people recognized it early. He could ride before he could speak in sentences. He could handle weapons with an instinct that seemed almost supernatural. By his late teens, Khalid had begun to acquire a reputation as a cavalry officer. skilled, ruthless, perfectly calibrated in his use of violence. The pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula was not a unified place. It was a network of tribal confederations, merchant cities, and small kingdoms, all competing for water, pasture, trade routes, and power. Warfare was constant, low intensity, but the stakes were total. Tribes could be obliterated, clans could be erased, and cavalry, trained, coordinated cavalry, was the ultimate weapon. A single charge of mounted archers could break infantry. One man on horseback could kill 3 or 4 men on foot. An organized cavalry unit could destroy an entire tribal army. Khalid became the master of this art. Between 620 and 625, in the years just before and during the early Islamic wars, Al-Tabari records that Khalid fought in multiple tribal conflicts outside Medina. He fought for Quraysh against rival tribes. He fought to protect Meccan trade interests. In each engagement, his tactical sense appeared. He didn't just charge, he maneuvered. He found flanks. He identified weak points. He struck where the enemy was vulnerable.
And then came Uhud. After the battle, Khalid became essential to Quraysh's defense. The Muslims were not defeated. They would return, stronger. The revelation of Islam was spreading through Arabia. More tribes were converting. The pagan Arab Confederation needed its best military mind fully committed to the cause of stopping Islam's expansion. For the next 2 years, Khalid rode in Quraysh's service. In 626, when the Muslims attempted to assault Mecca itself, Khalid led cavalry patrols that helped repel them. When tribes sympathetic to Islam attacked Quraysh caravans, Khalid organized counterattacks. He became indispensable. He became feared. He became, in the minds of the early Muslims, the physical incarnation of paganism's resistance to their faith. But something was changing. By 627, reports began to circulate among the tribes. Khalid ibn al-Walid was asking questions. Not out loud, not where it would matter politically, but in conversations with religious scholars from Syria, Christian monks and Jewish teachers who passed through Mecca on trade routes. Khalid was asking about God, about truth, about revelation. The historians Al-Tabari and Ibn Sa'd, both writing in the 9th century from earlier biographical records, suggest that Khalid was troubled by contradictions he perceived in pagan Arab theology. The Quraysh worshipped idols, 360 of them, one for each day of the lunar year. But these gods had no unity. They made no sense. They demanded human sacrifice in some regions, not in others. They promised reward, but offered suffering. Khalid was a martial man, a pragmatist. He understood cause and effect. In theology, he could find neither cause nor effect, neither reason nor revelation. It was in these years that Khalid ibn al-Walid encountered the Islamic message in a new way. Not as a military threat, that he understood perfectly, but as an intellectual proposition, as something with internal coherence. The Islamic claim was radical and simple. There was one God, one creator, one judge. No idols, no intermediaries. Just direct relationship between human and divine. According to the biographical records preserved by Ibn Sa'd and Al-Tabari, Khalid was also influenced by the story of his own tribe member, his uncle, Al-Abbas, who had converted to Islam. And he was moved by accounts of the Prophet Muhammad's character, his mercy, his honesty, his fulfillment of prophecies that Khalid had heard in Christian and Jewish teachings from Syrian scholars. By late 627, Khalid made his decision. He would leave Mecca. He would travel to Medina. He would meet the man he had fought against for years, he would offer his allegiance to Islam. The journey was dangerous. If Quraysh discovered his intention, they would kill him. They would consider it the ultimate betrayal. Khalid rode northeast from Mecca toward Medina. The journey took several days through open desert. He traveled light, with minimal escort, alert to patrols that might recognize him. When he arrived in Medina, the Muslim community's reaction was shock mixed with extreme caution. Khalid ibn al-Walid was arriving at their gates. Khalid, the sword of Quraysh, the man who had broken their army at Uhud and killed 70 of their brothers. How could they trust him? Was this a spy? Was this a trap? According to al-Tabari's account, preserved in his History of the Prophets and Kings, Khalid requested an audience with the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad agreed. In that meeting, Khalid made his declaration. He accepted Islam. He pledged his loyalty to the Islamic community. He offered his military expertise to the Islamic cause. Muhammad's response was extraordinary. Rather than executing Khalid for his past crimes, the Islamic law of the time would have permitted it, Muhammad welcomed him. The Prophet recognized what others in Medina were still struggling to accept, that Khalid's conversion was genuine, that his tactical genius could serve Islam, that his past sins were erased by his acceptance of faith. There is a well-documented saying attributed to Muhammad at this moment, preserved in multiple historical accounts. When Khalid declared his conversion, Muhammad said, "I have been waiting for you." The exact words may vary in the historical sources. Al-Tabari gives one version, Ibn Ishaq gives another, but the meaning is consistent. Muhammad understood Khalid's potential immediately. He understood that this man, this warrior, this brilliant tactician, could become Islam's greatest military asset. But first, Khalid had to prove himself to his new community. Trust, he knew, was not given. It was earned. The first test came almost immediately. In 629, just 2 years after his conversion, Muhammad ordered a military expedition to a place called Mu'tah near the Dead Sea. The goal was to confront a Byzantine/Arab Christian tribal confederation that had threatened Islamic merchants traveling to Syria. This was a significant engagement, the largest Islamic military operation yet undertaken. The Muslims were going up against not just Arab tribes, but the influence and potential intervention of the Byzantine Empire itself. Muhammad appointed various commanders for the Mu'tah campaign, and Khalid was among them. But there was a deeper test here than just military success. This was a political test. The Muslim community was asking, is Khalid truly one of us, or is he a Trojan horse? According to al-Tabari and al-Baladuri, the Mu'tah campaign encountered fierce resistance. The Islamic force, estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000 warriors, engaged a much larger pagan Arab/Byzantine coalition. The fighting was intense. 3 Islamic commanders were killed in succession: Zayd ibn Haritha, Jafar ibn Abi Talib, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha. With each death, the Muslim army risked complete collapse. They were outnumbered. They were far from home. Their commanders were falling. And then, Khalid ibn al-Walid took charge. Despite not being the senior commander, that role had belonged to the earlier officers. Khalid assumed battlefield control. He reorganized the Muslim infantry. He shifted their formations. He identified the enemy's weakness, their overextension and reliance on expected Arab cavalry tactics. Khalid countered with unexpected maneuvers. He used feints. He concealed troop movements. He struck at unexpected angles.
The Islamic army, through Khalid's tactical genius, managed to hold the field. They didn't achieve a crushing victory, but they forced the Byzantine-aligned confederation to withdraw. They survived. They were able to regroup and eventually retreat toward Medina in good order, not a rout, but a strategic withdrawal. More importantly, they won. And everyone understood who had won it for them. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the former enemy, had saved the Islamic army. When Khalid returned to Medina, the trust transformed. He was no longer the convert being tested. He was the general who had delivered victory when all seemed lost. Muhammad honored him publicly. The community embraced him. And Khalid began to understand his role in Islamic history. He was not just a warrior. He was going to be the instrument through which Islamic military expansion would be achieved. The next 4 years, from 629 to 633, saw a gradual Islamic expansion. More tribes converted. The religion spread through Arabia. But the final confrontation was always inevitable. What would happen when Islam expanded into the territories of the two great superpowers, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east? These empires had ruled the known world for centuries. They had armies, logistics, fortifications, experience. Could this new Arabian religion possibly threaten them? The answer would be Khalid ibn al-Walid. After Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the Islamic community chose Abu Bakr as the first caliph, the leader who would guide the young religion into its future. Abu Bakr understood what Muhammad had understood. Khalid was the key to military expansion. Within months of taking power, Abu Bakr authorized Khalid to lead an army into Iraq. Iraq at this time was nominally under Sassanid Persian rule, but it was a frontier region. The Sassanid Empire was vast and powerful, but it was also weakened by decades of war with the Byzantine Empire. The local Arab tribes in Iraq were semi-autonomous. Sassanid control was more nominal than actual. This was the opening that Islamic strategy would exploit. Khalid ibn al-Walid was given command of a force of about 18,000 warriors, a massive army for the time. By 633 CE, he was marching northeast from Arabia into Iraq. And what followed was not a series of battles. It was a masterpiece of military strategy.
According to al-Baladuri's Conquest of the Lands and al-Tabari's detailed accounts, Khalid's campaign in Iraq between 633 and 634 was characterized by 3 elements: extraordinary speed, perfect tactical execution, and psychological warfare that caused enemy forces to surrender before engaging. Khalid would move his army impossibly fast across the desert. He would appear at locations where the enemy believed he could not possibly reach. He would strike at supply lines and communication routes. When Arab tribal confederations tried to unite against him, Khalid would defeat them separately through tactical maneuver. The details of specific battles, Walaja, Firaz, Hira, are preserved in Islamic historical sources with remarkable consistency. At the Battle of Walaja in particular, which occurred in 633 CE, Khalid executed a tactical maneuver so sophisticated that it essentially invented a new form of battlefield strategy. The Sassanid/Arab coalition defending Iraq numbered perhaps 40,000 warriors. They were entrenched. They held superior numbers. Khalid commanded 18,000. By conventional military logic, he should have been defeated. But Khalid did something unexpected. He split his cavalry force.
while the main body engaged the coalition directly, a frontal assault that seemed suicidal. A second cavalry unit circled around the enemy's rear and came at them from behind. The coalition was trapped between two Islamic forces. They couldn't retreat. They couldn't maneuver. They were crushed. Al-Tabari records the casualties at Walaja as possibly exaggerated in the sources. Early Islamic histories sometimes inflated numbers for propaganda. But the consensus among modern historians like Hugh Kennedy and Fred Donner, who have cross-referenced the Islamic accounts with Byzantine and Sassanid sources, is that the battle was decisive. Khalid's double envelopment maneuver was a genuine breakthrough in military tactics. It would be discussed by military theorists for centuries afterward. After Walaja, the campaign accelerated. Khalid moved through Iraq with unprecedented speed. Al-Baladuri records that he covered over 400 miles in a matter of weeks, which would have required moving his entire army, warriors, supplies, wounded, at a pace that seemed impossible according to contemporary military standards. He was not just winning battles. He was rewriting the rules of what an army could do. By early 634 CE, after less than a year of campaign, Khalid had essentially secured Iraq for Islam. The major cities, Hira, Anbar, Walaja, had fallen or surrendered. The Sassanid Empire, reeling from the news that a relatively small Arabian force was conquering their frontier province, realized they faced an existential threat. For the first time in centuries, a power had emerged from Arabia that could challenge them. In 634 CE, at a place called Firaz, Khalid fought what would be his last undefeated battle. A combined Byzantine-Sassanid force, desperate to stop the Islamic advance before it became unstoppable, was assembled to confront him. Again, Khalid was outnumbered. Again, he was far from his supply lines. Again, conventional military logic suggested defeat. And again, Khalid won, through superior tactics and brilliant maneuver. After Firaz, the campaign slowed. Not because Khalid was defeated, but because the Islamic community was consolidating its gains. Syria, the wealthy Byzantine province to the west, was being brought into Islamic control through other military operations. Iraq was secured. The Sassanid and Byzantine empires, both shocked by the speed of Islamic expansion, were preparing their defenses for the long war that would follow. Khalid had achieved something unprecedented. In less than 2 years of campaigning, he had defeated both the Sassanid and Byzantine empires in significant engagements. He had conquered territory. He had proven that Arabian warriors, with superior tactics and motivation, could defeat professional imperial armies. He had changed the trajectory of world history. But success, as always in military history, carries within it the seeds of future tragedy. In 638 CE, some accounts say, Khalid was removed from command by the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. The reasons, preserved in historical sources, were both political and personal. Umar, a brilliant administrator, but more cautious military mind than Abu Bakr, began to fear Khalid's popularity. The Muslim soldiers loved him. The conquered populations respected him. In the early Islamic state, where power was still consolidating and the rules of succession were not yet settled, a general this popular could pose a threat to caliphal authority.
Al-Tabari records that Umar, in one of his letters to his provincial governors, expressed concern about Khalid's independence. Umar worried that Khalid's loyalty was to his own honor and reputation, not to the caliph's authority. This was partly unfair. Khalid had been loyal, but it was also politically astute. Umar understood that no state can afford to have a general more popular than its leader. So Khalid was removed. His command went to other generals. His direct role in the conquest ended. He was given an administrative position, but it lacked the military authority he had wielded. For a warrior whose entire identity was built on battlefield success, this was a kind of living death. Khalid spent his final years in Homs, in the province of Syria. He was still honored, he was still respected, but he was no longer making history. He was no longer the instrument of Islamic expansion. He was simply an elderly general, watching younger commanders achieve what he had pioneered. In 638 CE, Khalid ibn al-Walid died. The historical sources are uncertain about the exact cause: plague, illness, old age. What is certain is that he died relatively quietly. There was no grand funeral narrative, no epic poetry celebrating his passing, no grand tomb. Khalid, the greatest general Islam would ever produce, faded from history almost as quickly as he had entered it. For the next 13 centuries, Islamic historians would remember Khalid. They would tell stories of his battles. They would cite him as an example of military brilliance. But in the grand narrative of Islamic history, he was overshadowed. The focus shifted to the administrators, the caliphs and their governors. The early Islamic historians, many writing under later dynasties that were suspicious of independent military power, began to subtly de-emphasize Khalid's role. He was not forgotten exactly, but he was pushed to the margins. This was not deliberate falsification. It was something more subtle. Selective emphasis. Khalid's victories were recorded, but other generals were highlighted. His tactical innovations were mentioned, but presented as obvious. His conversion was noted, but without dwelling on the theological journey that had brought him to Islam. Gradually, over centuries, Khalid ibn al-Walid became less Khalid the genius and more Khalid the footnote. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, something remarkable happened. Modern historians, armed with new methodologies and access to multiple sources, Islamic, Byzantine, Sassanid, began to re-examine the early Islamic conquests with fresh eyes. Scholars like Fred Donner, Hugh Kennedy, and Tayyib el-Hibri looked at what the sources actually said, rather than accepting later Islamic tradition's streamlined narrative. And what they found was extraordinary. They found that the speed of Islamic conquest in Iraq and Syria could not be explained by any military advantage in numbers or weapons. The Sassanid and Byzantine empires were far more militarily sophisticated than the Arabian tribes. Yet they were being defeated. How? The answer was Khalid ibn al-Walid. When modern military historians analyzed the battles, Walaja in particular, they recognized them as sophisticated tactical maneuvers. The double envelopment at Walaja was not luck. It was not accident. It was brilliant military strategy executed with precision. Khalid had not just been a successful general. He had been a military genius of the highest order. His tactics prefigured the sophisticated maneuvers that would define military strategy for centuries. Modern scholarship has also recovered Khalid's faith journey. When historians carefully read the early sources, particularly al-Tabari and Ibn Sa'd, they find a genuine spiritual and intellectual transformation. Khalid was not a pragmatist who converted because Islam was winning. He was a man who had engaged seriously with theological questions and had come to a genuine conviction. His conversion was authentic. His loyalty to Islam was real. He was not a mercenary who had switched sides. He was a believer. This rediscovery of Khalid ibn al-Walid in modern scholarship has had remarkable consequences. In the Arab world particularly, Khalid has become a symbol. He is studied in military academies. He is cited as an example of tactical brilliance. He is invoked in discussions of Islamic history and the nature of military strategy. But more than that, he has become a symbol of something deeper. The idea that history is not fixed, but is constantly being rewritten as new evidence emerges and new perspectives are applied. For 13 centuries, Khalid was the man history forgot. Then scholarship recovered him. Then popular history remembered him.
And now, when we look at the early Islamic conquests, Khalid ibn al-Walid stands at the center of the story where he always belonged, as the man who changed the world through brilliant military innovation and tactical genius. There is a profound irony in Khalid's story. He began as Islam's deadliest enemy. He killed Muslims. He nearly destroyed the Islamic movement when it was vulnerable. He was, in every meaningful sense, an opponent of faith. But through conversion, through commitment, through the application of his talents to a new cause, he became Islam's greatest asset. The enemy became the hero. Yet even this transformation was almost lost. Even his heroism nearly faded from history. Khalid ibn al-Walid was twice erased, once by his political enemies who removed him from power, and once by the march of history itself, which nearly buried his memory beneath the weight of later events and competing narratives. But he was never truly gone. In the historical record, in the battle accounts, in the military treatises that would study Walaja and other engagements, Khalid was always there. For anyone willing to look carefully, willing to read the sources critically, willing to listen to what history actually says, rather than what comfortable narratives suggest, Khalid ibn al-Walid was always undefeated. What does this mean for us at this distance of nearly 14 centuries? It means, perhaps, that history is not destiny. It means that people contain multitudes, that a former enemy can become an ally, that a warrior can find faith, that a brilliant mind can serve a cause greater than itself. It means that the stories we tell about the past matter, because they shape how we understand ourselves in the present. Khalid ibn al-Walid lived in a world of absolute choices: paganism or faith, war or peace, loyalty or betrayal. He chose, he committed, he transformed. And through that transformation, he became the greatest general of his age. The Islamic tradition would eventually give him a title that summarized everything: Saif Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of Allah. Not because he never lost a battle, though he never did. Not because he conquered more territory than others, though he conquered vast lands. But because he was, in essence, an instrument perfectly calibrated for a single purpose. When directed toward a target, he struck. When aimed at a goal, he achieved it. When asked to serve, he served completely. In the end, that is perhaps the deepest lesson of Khalid ibn al-Walid. Not that he was invincible, though he was. Not that he was brilliant, though he was. But that he was, ultimately, transformable. That a human being, confronted with truth, can change completely. That an enemy can become a hero. That history, even when it tries to bury a story, cannot erase it forever. The sword of Allah was never sheathed. But in the end, it was not his sword that mattered most. It was his choice. It was his conversion. It was his willingness to abandon everything he had known and to commit himself entirely to something new. That choice, more than any victory, made Khalid ibn al-Walid undefeated.